Immortals of Aveum is one of the messiest games I have played this year. That being said, I actually had a pretty good time. The game has this feeling like it was built by teams of developers, writers, and artists that never spoke to each other once over the entire development process other than through emails and Slack group chats. The combat, the art, the story, the tone, the in-game mechanics, they all feel like they're individual pieces jammed together into a casserole dish with hopes of coming out the oven as an edible meal. But the fact that this is Ascendant Studios' first video game and the creative director worked on Call of Duty specifically for Sledgehammer Games when they were actually a decent studio, I figured that I would give this game a shot. And while I was likely going to try out Immortals of Aveum anyways as an aspiring reviewer, I figured it would be one of those games that I would quit halfway through as it likely wouldn't be good enough to endure for that 20 or so hours. But I am surprised as you to report back that this game was actually pretty fun. It wasn't spectacular or anything like that, but the gameplay was solid with great combat, fun boss encounters, and decent in-game systems. And while I went in with low expectations, I could have never anticipated the writing to be as ham-fisted as it was. So be ready to expect a ton of millennial exposition forced down your throat like a spoonful of expired medicine. But if you can stomach the cringy dialogue, I think the combat might just be good enough to hook you in while we wait for some true highlights of 2023 to come around. This is Immortals of Aveum. I like to start off my reviews talking about performance because, in my eyes, it's hard to decide whether or not a game is good or bad if you can't play it on your machine. I played on PC only, and I won't say that this game is unplayable or anything like that, but it is a little taxing and can be finicky at times, especially with the frame rate, but we're going to get to that in just a second. The configuration menu is pretty standard as it has all the things you would come to expect, nothing special, but it gets the job done. However, the VRAM and the CPU measurement tools inside of the menu are seemingly broken as they would not read my PC's specifications accurately. I saw online that this was the case with other people who tested the game as well, but I am not exactly sure what the issue is or what the measurements Ascendant Studios are using, so I'm going to be making some assumptions here. Feel free to correct me in the comments. I am not attempting to be an expert at all. I played this game on my laptop with a 4090 and my main PC with a 3080 Ti, and I was getting very weird results when using this menu. For example, my 3080 Ti has 12 gigabytes of VRAM, so you would assume that the measurement on the top right-hand corner of the screen was represented in megabytes, but it kept displaying I only had 829 of something, as there was no units displayed to clarify. Also, when using my laptop with the 4090 that has 16 gigabytes of VRAM, Immortals of Aveum was displaying 875 mystery units of whatever, leading me to really not be sure what I was configuring. The CPU limit measurement also kept fluctuating every time I clicked reset to default, so I had no idea what the hell was going on with this menu. I ended up just letting the game use its auto configuration rather than mess with it myself, as I wasn't sure if I was just reading things incorrectly and it would potentially push my hardware further than it could handle, which would have just cost me thousands of dollars if I ended up breaking something, and that would have been my fault. Aside from all of the bullshit in the menu, Immortals of Aveum actually plays decently well. The frame rates can be a bit all over the place at times, but I would say after the first 4 or 5 chapters, they are very consistent and in the high 80s and 90s at 4K with settings on high. The graphics in the game are okay, but they suffer from the same issue that Jedi Survivor does, where you see this fuzziness coating over everything, which leaves things looking kind of blurry and unnatural. But here's where I get a little confused. I'm not sure if this is a publisher problem, as both of these games are published by EA, or maybe it's an Unreal Engine issue, as both of these games are developed on Unreal Engine. I have played other games on Unreal, and I often don't notice this same fuzziness that kind of coats the objects inside of your play session. It's something that's always bothered me inside of these particular EA titles, but you do ultimately get used to it over time.
Holy shit.
You've never seen the Pentaside up close.
You saw how I lived under a giant bridge.
A giant bridge, sir.
Before we get to the gameplay breakdown, I want to discuss the tone of the game first because it is absolutely terrible. It's cliche in every way, and the writers are just not very good, generally speaking, and it's jam-packed full of millennial political references, social commentary, and everybody is just so snarky and sarcastic. It's just garbage. There are, of course, the obligatory references to racism, sexism, communism, fascism, and of course, all the gender roles are swapped.
So, it is happening?
Shut up. Welcome to the path.
So tell me, Sarah, when did you say to yourself, hey, bigotry, it's not really so bad, is it?
I may have neglected to mention that the Ormic are notoriously territorial underneath their bohemian facade.
Oh, that's rich, coming from a pampered classist jackboot masquerading as some champion of justice.
It feels like somebody had a bowl of hot topic issues written on pieces of paper and just randomly selected them in order to make this game relevant in the current political landscape. But listen, I genuinely don't give a shit if people make content talking about their political beliefs. They have just as much freedom of speech as I or anyone else does. It's just so tiring at this point, and I think even people who like this style of commentary are getting annoyed by it. The main problem with this kind of writing isn't the topics themselves, but the fact that the people writing about it aren't deep thinkers. They only care about injecting trendy opinions into their media to use as a cudgel rather than to discuss these ideas genuinely. Because in order to do that, it would require a modicum of criticism to push back on your own conceptualizations in order to flush things out fairly and thoroughly. If these writers really want to discuss hot button political issues that matter to them, then they can do that. That's totally fine. But just do it in a manner that provides some ounce of introspection, as making the main male character call his female officer sir for 20 hours isn't groundbreaking, it's silly shoehorned in nonsense. As I mentioned in the introduction of the review, the game feels somewhat disconnected, and in some cases that can be beneficial for a game as it will allow you to manage your expectations more reasonably when you are playing through it. However, when it comes to the main narrative, it really is unfortunate how much BS is shoved into the plot as it brings down what could have been a somewhat interesting tale. I should state that some of the game's story runs into issues because it's plainly obvious that the producers cut a ton of content out from this game. The main character's motive changes and the scenes feel very rushed and glued together, almost as if they were made by two different teams with no indication as to what the other was doing. And this same pattern follows along with the characters. While they are goofy and cringy, they are voice acted pretty well in my opinion, but the dialogue is off-putting for the most part, making a majority of them, besides a couple, entirely unlikable, which is a shame because they clearly had great voice talent here. Immortals starts off by introducing you to the main character Jack and his best friend Luna, who are a couple of poor kids that live in the favelas above a tear in the ground that has magic pouring out of it. There ends up being an attack on their home where Luna is killed. This is where you find out the main character Jack has super magic powers the whole time, and that most people in the world do not have this specific combination of magical gifts. While most people can use one color type of magic, Jack can use all three colors, which makes him a triarch, which in this timeline is apparently exceptionally rare. The end goal of the game is to stop the main villain Sandrak, who is a madman that wants to control all of the magic in the world by connecting it via a binding stone. This stone is so powerful that he can withdraw magic from anyone, anywhere, at any time, as it will essentially be a stopgap between the main magic source and the human's connection to it. During our battles in this Everwar, we find out that the magic we are using to fight is actually a resource which is harming the world as well. This means that the state of the world that the humans are fighting against is caused by the methodology in which they are fighting. And this is kind of a cool premise. As you can see, our characters are placed in a very tough situation where they're damned if they do or damned if they don't. Throughout the adventure, there are multiple subplots that lead Jack and his team to different potential conclusions about how to rein in the magic and stop Sandrak. This ultimately shows our characters being either stopped in their tracks with an idea or misguided with some sort of concept, or they have to pivot into making quick judgments of how to restore peace amongst the world. And this is a very tough decision they have to make, as they have to figure out how to keep the magic inside of their world while also bringing things back to their non-destructive state of existence. There is a lot of twisting and turning in this story. There is betrayal and deceit, mystery and intrigue, loss and pain. It's genuinely not that bad. But when they mix in that snarky millennial garbage of quips and social justice commentary, it immediately pulls you out of the story and reminds you that this is just another piece of media. One of my favorite aspects of video games is seeing what the art team delivers when it comes to building out their world, as I truly believe if a player is to spend hours upon hours in some virtual space, the art inside of it should be so damn good that it makes them never want to leave. Immortals does a fairly decent job of creating cool environments, but it feels like the level designers had a hard time deciding upon a unified vision. At times, Immortals of Aveum feels like a futuristic sci-fi game, and at other times it felt like some Norse mythology game. It was very difficult to feel a sense of cohesion when the world itself felt so ungrounded. That being said, the epic nature of the worlds could truly be magnificent at times and show off that AAA flair that makes you remember why these big budget blockbusters can be so special. You will experience levels that are pulling Jack through the vast emptiness of space and time, snowy mountainous regions, and hidden cities underground filled with species that have been cast out from society by humans' thirst for power and magic. Most of the time when it comes to creating a first-person shooter, having something that shoots is preferable. And in the case of Immortals of Aveum, the lack of guns poses a problem for the developers. Over many years of playing video games, I have often found that titles with first-person melee creates a tough situation in terms of translating that crunchy feedback that players are looking for when confronted with combat. The same can be said about video games where you're shooting magic from the character's hands. Now, I can't think of many first-person magic shooters, but I will tell you right now, I was almost certain that the gameplay in Aveum was going to feel weak, lifeless, and floaty, similar to something like Forspoken. And to my surprise, that isn't the case at all. The gameplay, movement, combat, it all feels really great actually. And sure, there's a bit of floatiness with some of the jumping and hovering mechanics, but you get used to that relatively quickly. In 2019, a Call of Duty Zombies map came out for Black Ops 4 called Ancient Evil. And in the game, the developers created wonder weapons that were magic and melee based. This has been the only game I have ever played that has similar mechanics, so I would say if you have played this particular map before, then you will know what you're getting yourself into with Immortals of Aveum, at least at a very basic level. This actually makes a ton of sense as well, since the director of Immortals of Aveum worked on Call of Duty for many years over at Sledgehammer. And while Sledgehammer Games didn't develop Treyarch Zombies, I wouldn't be surprised if they didn't assist on it in some way, shape, or form, as the Call of Duty teams are always passing things off to one another for extra support since their games are so large. But if someone asked me to give an elevator pitch for Immortals of Aveum, I would tell them that it kind of feels like Doom Eternal and Call of Duty had a magic baby. This is in part due to its very linear campaign, combat mechanics, and gameplay feel, along with its light platforming and puzzle solving. Throughout the game, you will notice that these puzzles are very similar to games like God of War or Jedi Survivor, where you have to shoot colors on a wall in a certain amount of time in order, or use specific tools in your arsenal in order to solve them. And while this isn't necessarily difficult to solve, it can help to curate critical thinking skills, and they're just generally fun to do. There is one level in particular where you're trying to make your way through a large pool of lava, and in order to do so, you need to solve multiple puzzles at the same time while also surviving decently difficult boss encounters. The devs really did a great job here by curating a pinnacle moment in Immortals to make sure that the player was well aware of all of the skills and features the game had been showing you up to this point. It really was a solid showcase at making you think for a moment and apply every ounce of G fuel your gamer brain could muster. I really wish there was more of these moments in Immortals of Aveum, because the pacing of these puzzles was done excellently. There was never an incident where you were stuck for too long on something stupid, as you were always able to inch forward with your progression. This is very important, as stopping a game dead in its tracks for an irrelevant reason is never good gameplay design, as you always want to be pushing forward. There are also secret teleporters that you will find which lead you to a special area similar to Jedi Survivor, where you would overcome an obstacle or enemy encounter and then are rewarded with some new skill that you didn't have before. This will take you to a secret boss fight that's actually pretty damn hard. I actually still haven't beaten one of these bosses yet, and likely never will, as my save file was overwritten by my cloud syncing feature on Steam, but let me know in the comments if you have beaten one of these mega bosses, as I am curious what the reward is for doing so. Something I really like about Immortals of Aveum is that it doesn't waste your time with giving you all of the basic skills right from the beginning of the game. Your double jump, your lash, all 3 magic sigils, your shield, and much more. Ascendant Studios gives you almost everything right from the get-go, and then throughout the game, you're constantly building up your character rather than being drip-fed basic abilities that could have been there from the start. Of course, there are a few skills that you will garner throughout the game, like being able to use a grappling hook, but it makes sense to have a little bit of a progression system outside of the skill tree. That way, there are peak moments to look forward to. It only becomes a problem when these skills skills are something we have seen in video games a million times before and are removed and repackaged as a whole entire feature. The progression tree, on the other hand, is simple, basic, straightforward. It does exactly what you need and want it to do, and I have to say that some of the upgrade nodes are fairly substantial, and a lot of the time I was looking at this thing, weighing my pros and cons, totally unsure of what I wanted to invest my skill points in. And I think anytime a skill tree makes you endure tough decision making, that means the devs have done a good job, more or less, at placing meaning inside of the abilities offered. There is also a bit of a loot game inside of Immortals of Aveum, which has you finding various weapons and wearables that will buff your stats. To be honest, you will find pretty good stuff throughout the game from beating bosses and whatnot, so you don't need to focus too much on build diversity, as it's really not that type of game, but it is slightly available if you do care about that. But what I really enjoyed about finding loot was nothing was ever too far out of the way, and chests were always en route to the next main campaign point, so earning these goodies never felt like a chore. Plus, you could deconstruct loot you don't want at an upgrade station and then inject that currency into your current loot, making it much stronger, which is something I really enjoy for a simple, smooth single-player experience. I know we briefly touched on the topic that Brett Robbins, who directed this game, has a ton of experience inside of the FPS genre, and arguably no better experience to learn the ins and outs of the FPS trade would be to work for Bobby Kotick at Activision, learning how to steal breast milk from your fellow coworkers. I mean, work on shooters, work at Call of... Fuck, you guys, you know what I mean. I'm sorry, guys. I forgot what I was doing for a second. Call of Duty, for all of its ups and downs, is still the best first-person shooter on the market. And it's clear that Ascendant Studios went into this game knowing full well what their intention would be when building out this game's core combat loop. Many other people, myself included, are inherently relating this to COD, which I think the devs are kind of insulted by. But in my opinion, that's a great compliment, as that Call of Duty engine has been refined greatly over many years. And the fact that Brett Robbins and his team used Unreal Engine 5 and made a competing shooter with magic is a very impressive feat of engineering from where I'm sitting. That being said, from a gameplay and combat mechanics standpoint, it really isn't fair to compare the two, because many FPS games use all of the same types of mechanics as the framework has been laid out, and the devs truly know what works and what doesn't at this point in the gaming industry's lifecycle. So the way combat works is you have 3 types of weapons called sigils. You have 3 weapon accessories, a lash, a totem, and an amulet, and then you have a variety of specialist abilities, which I think you can have up to 6 of them active at one time. And to keep things simple, everything is based around the core ideology of the game's RGB magic system. You also have a shield, a dash, and the ability to double jump and hover. So the player has their blue magic sigil, which is like your tac rifle, a green magic sigil, which is like the SMG class, and a red magic sigil, which is like a shotgun or a heavy weapons class. Everything in the game can be upgraded via your upgrade station, which are located throughout the game using your in-game currency, as well as inside of your menu using your skill tree and skill points. Not to mention, you can find better tier loot through playing the campaign and doing side content and upgrade that as well, so there is always a bit of a chase towards higher and better progression and loot, even if it is very slight and not as important as you may think it is. I would say the best part about finding different sigils throughout your playthrough is they will all have slightly different variations, which give you different firing abilities, which can ultimately change how you engage in combat. So perhaps I have a red sigil that outputs 500 plus damage, but it only has 1 shot per reload, versus a red sigil that does 150 damage per shot with 3 shots before you reload. I really like these kinds of gameplay choices, as they are just simple ones to make. They don't impede the flow of gameplay, as you can really do well with any of them, and it doesn't take focus away from the skill tree itself or previous upgrades you made to other items in your past. You're always moving forward rather than getting stuck on arbitrary decisions that will inevitably be meaningless as soon as the game's credits roll. Now, the weapon accessories are actually kind of a weird thing to use in my opinion. I like them, I do, but I found myself forgetting about them more than not, and I pretty much only used the lash as it would pull enemies closer to me, or it would help me traverse around the map. The amulet would fire a red beam of corrosive energy, which was pretty nice, but I don't think I had it upgraded enough in my skill tree to see any real benefit. The last accessory was a totem that fired a little green glob so that you could slow enemies down that were much too quick to keep an eye on. But I found it was much more useful for traveling when you needed to slow down a platform to prevent you from falling to your ultimate demise. But in my humble opinion, where the gameplay really starts to feel great is when you mix in all of the sigil gunplay and the special abilities and you start to get into a flow state that only comes when you get into those meaty combat encounters. These specialist abilities are just so damn satisfying. Truly, they are super useful and most importantly, super powerful. One of the core principles of combat in this game is to make sure that you are using the correct color magic with the correct color enemy type, at least most of the time anyway, and these abilities will help you to maim the enemies of the correct color and even take down ones that aren't the right one as well. I unfortunately only locked 4 of these abilities, but the best ones that I used during my playthrough were a red colored super punch that would rush in and beat the ever-living shit out of someone, and a green magic ability that would shoot a swarm of these beams targeting the enemy from nearly anywhere on the map. When you're flying around, shooting, dodging, using your shield, and then combining all of your specialists and accessories, damn, combat just becomes so satisfying. And the best part is that it feels so familiar. It might take a second or two to get used to the movement, but once you do, it's almost like you've played this game before, but that isn't meant to be negative. It just means that you don't have to waste your time on something that you're unsure about, as you know what you are getting yourself into right from the beginning. From the writing versus the voice acting to the art design versus the level design and the many other elements to this game, the enemy design can feel a bit disjointed as well. Honestly, I really wasn't sure what 90% of the enemies were, except for these like snake dragons that live inside of the purple muck that you'll walk across. There are weird soldiers, magic creatures, alien looking bugs, dragon things, humans. I mean, it's all over the place, to be quite frank. There is a point in the game where you learn more about what the terra below humanity is and how it's pulling elements away from the human mind and imagination. I'm not sure if these creatures are all from the human mind or what. I can't really remember if there was any true explanation for their existence other than just kind of what I'm assuming from the later chapters of the game's narrative. I don't really think it's that big of a deal because I'm not super in love with the game's lore anyhow, but nothing really felt like it made sense. The player is just fighting enemies to fight enemies, and it didn't really make a ton of sense which type of enemy was or wasn't present. You're just kind of moving along the tracks of this virtual ride and killing shit when the devs tell you to kill shit, and I'm totally fine with that, by the way. I do wish there was more enemy density in the first 5 or 6 chapters, as it is so easy for about the first third or so, and it doesn't even get remotely challenging until the final chapters. There are, of course, your general enemies and a range of mid to high level mini bosses, and they all have color weaknesses to some degree depending on what shield color they represent or what color they are specifically. Some enemies don't have to be killed by a specific color, but it may help to kill them faster if you use an associated color against them. But for most low level enemies, you are free to use whatever weapons you feel most comfortable with or just have the most fun using. As far as actual bosses go in this game, I was a little disappointed as there weren't a ton, but the fights that were there were pretty damn good. My favorite boss fight by far was, of course, the final encounter with Sandrak, but I won't spoil that for you. But I will show a close second favorite, which was a giant construct that turns against you after having been controlled by your magic just moments prior. In order to take him down, you need to chip off colored rocks from his body while dodging his enormous attacks. I really enjoy boss fights with light puzzle solving mechanics rather than turning them into bullet sponges, as it gives the player something to strive for rather than mindlessly pressing a button. The combat and boss fights are the highlight here for Immortals of Aveum, and I wouldn't go into this game expecting some brilliant story or top tier level world design. Play this game for the combat, the controls, and the power fantasy. That is what it's offering you, and just don't overthink it. 2023 is truly stuffed to the brim with amazing games. Whether it's Resident Evil 4 Remake or Starfield, there is so much content to chew through, so I don't blame you for potentially skipping out on Immortals of Aveum. But aside from its horrid dialogue and cringy millennial talking points, there is really a fun shooter underneath it all that runs decently well with no major bugs or game-breaking issues, and will take you around 15-20 hours to complete. So while I wouldn't recommend skipping whatever AAA banger that you're waiting for Immortals of Aveum, I would keep it higher on your backlog list, or maybe buy it during a sale, as you'll have a great time shooting and blowing shit up while laughing at how ridiculous the storyline is.